It's great to have you both together today for our conversation. Debt and utilities in the eye of the storm. I know you're both founding members of the Women's Utilities Network, but tell us a bit more about yourself, Jo.
Oh, well, I've been in the industry or the sector for over 25 years now. So I'm a long haul junkie, I think, in terms of energy. I'm originally an accountant and I fell into energy and have basically worked my way originally mainly in retail with a couple of retail customers, suppliers, and then latterly really focused on the transition of the market as sort of renewables have become more predominant, and how we generate electricity as well as linking it back into the consumer and sort of business consumers as well. So I've now, for the last 4 years, I've had my own business working as an independent consultant. So at the moment, my sort of spread across a variety of different areas. So I've sort of got clients in the investor space and also sort of large consumers. Also, I work with businesses who are sort of trying to find value in the market. But I'm a chair of a board with tech who do all the buying for most of the universities in the country. We've got 137 of the universities. We buy under one large contract, and we've got a very large power purchase agreement as well, which was the first of its kind. So that's a sort of really exciting space as well. And I also work with Ofgem on one of their panels. I'm sort of an expert panel member, and that's really looking at National Grid's ESO, the energy system operator, to understand whether they're delivering, I suppose, value for consumers in all the work they're doing in balancing the system. Are they actually delivering value for consumers? So are they doing it in the best way? It's a very large, expensive part of the market, and it's and that feeds right the way through to consumers. So lots of different aspects, but generally you could call me an energy geek.
Thanks so much, Jo. And Hayley?
So I run a training and consultancy company called Think Inspire Create, known to our colleagues and customers as Tickle. It's a lot easier to say. And I've been doing that now for 5 years. Prior to that, I had a number of roles at British Gas, looking after their B2B part of the business. So predominantly in credit and risk management, looking at the customer collections and the customer operations side of the business. So that focus there in terms of being as effective and efficient as they can be and making sure that we minimized our debt risk exposure is somewhat carried into the business that I run today. And we're a small team working with primarily utility companies, but not exclusively. We like to take a different business every now and then just to kind of keep us on our toes and shake it up a bit. But primarily with utility companies in their operations business, looking at how we can support them finding those efficiencies and ultimately, saving costs for their business.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you. It's great to have such expertise together in kind of one room, essentially, well, one Zoom room. Hayley, I know you suggested the title of the discussion today based on some research you were doing for an article. It'd be great to hear a bit more about that.
Yes, so as a long-term credit management profession, a bit like what Jo said, really, I have tried to escape the credit management, the debt side of things. When I left British Gas, I did think I would try and do something different, but it is a bit kind of once you know something and you've got some experience and exposure in it, it's difficult to step away. But I think there's a part of me that is always very curious about what's happening and how people can make it better. So I was asked a few months ago whether or not I thought the impact on the utility sector would be the same now as it was in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis. In 2008, 2009, I was working at Centrica and I was responsible for the credit and risk team at British Gas Business. And I was trying to draw parallels between the two times, and it started me off and exploring. I know what I thought where I was now, but how different was it actually out in the market today if you were in those roles. So I started to call a couple of contacts out that are working in the sector to ask them about what the current market was like for them and how did it compare and what they were seeing. I'd gone in with a number of assumptions that it would actually be really quite bleak, because when we're all working from home, the only external impact we have is the media, isn't it? It's just what we hear in the media. So I'd gone to think that it was quite bleak, but I was quite surprised to hear that actually for a number of companies, the consumer position wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bleak. And I think it was still too early days for them to say exactly why, but the assumption was most people have been furloughed, and so we're still getting income. And because we couldn't go out and socialize and spend, we weren't spending as much money. So people were either managing to pay their bills or certainly managing to maintain some form of balance as well. So that was quite a pleasant surprise that was going quite well. Those that were supplying B2Bs really ranged, and that depended massively on who you were supplying. So if you were lucky enough to have a major contract with a big supermarket, you were doing pretty nicely, because as we know, the supermarkets have done incredibly well. But if you had maybe a pub group or a hotel group or something, actually there was a lot of challenges, because obviously they're not open, or they have been open intermittently, and their revenues have been sliced hugely. So I think there's been real mixed. And if you have a blended portfolio, maybe that's been easier to manage. But if you are specific to one customer base, then actually it's proving quite challenging for that individual company. And I think then starting to ask them, okay, so what are you doing going forward? And I think that there's still some space there. There's still some gaps, in terms of thinking, what are they going to do in the next 12 months?
It's quite interesting. I agree with everything Hayley said, and I think adding to that, I was talking to a supplier fairly recently, and they're talking about almost the calm before the storm, because whilst we've got the sort of the furlough protection and we've got grants and support for business, most are limping on. But actually, once all those are withdrawn, but you've still got to then accelerate out of the sort of situation that you found yourself in, and you're inevitably cash restricted. I can't think the word. I think there is a sense of actually it is the calm before the storm. So we might not, from an energy perspective and from a supplier impact, we might not yet have seen the worst. And there's a great deal of uncertainty on that. And I know we'll come on to talk about the price cap, but I think the regulators are recognising that as well.
So it sounds like to me that the worst may be yet to come for energy suppliers and debt management. Do we kind of have any ideas and insights of what that's going to look like and when that's going to happen?
Well, I think, like Jo just said, the storm is brewing, and there's so many things at play here. So the furlough scheme, obviously hot off the press, that's been extended now potentially to September. So that to a degree maybe help those who companies who ultimately might be making those people redundant. But I'm curious as to how that's going to play out if for organizations that are opening up as the restrictions end and they start to trade, will they be able to justify keeping people on furlough, and for how long? Will those businesses survive? I think there's the bounce back loans. We know from British banking that there's been something like £300 billion worth of loans done, which is 33% higher than in 2019, and they're forecasting at the moment that about £22 billion worth of that is unlikely to be recovered. So they're forecasting that we'll see business failures. But then on the other side, there's the 160 billion pounds that, again, the banks have said has been squirreled away by consumers largely during the lockdown periods. And is that some form of coiled spring that's going to come out and start spreading those payments and buying stuff? So we'll see more people going into pubs and restaurants and leisure centres and spending that money, which in turn helps that business, which makes them able to pay their bills. And I think at the moment there's so many unknowns. I suppose for me, I know your views, Jo, but this all opening up and things starting to move in the summer is quite good. I think if we were going into winter as well, and we would add energy price risk on that, then maybe it would be a perfect storm.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's that sector specific bit. So you can easily see, you know, people coming out and spending. So maybe retail does very well, but actually there's some horrific statistics around, you know, the numbers of pubs that are just shutting now, and those will not reopen, you know, so there is going to be real impact in the form of debt. and that's the reality. I mean, I was looking earlier as well, just at Citizens Advice and what they're talking about in terms of debt. And they were saying at the end of last year there were 2.1 million people who were struggling to pay their energy bills, and that had gone up by 600,000 in the year, and that was with furlough and with the support that was in place. So I think whereas we were in the doom and gloom scenario of unemployment was going to absolutely rocket, the current view seems to be it's not going to be as bad as we originally thought. But it's that mixture of, you know, everybody consumes energy. So whether you're a business or whether you're a, you know, individual at home, you know, the different impacts, I think I'm with Hayley in terms of it's very difficult to forecast exactly what will happen. But I think we will see, you know, undoubtedly we will see debt levels increasing.
It is so customer and industry centric. While we were exploring some of this, I started chatting to an energy manager, Paul Webb. I don't know if you know him, and we were talking about examples of businesses that were struggling, and leisure centres was a really interesting one, because I was asking him, so if I owned a leisure centre and I was going to be closed for a month or 2 months, things like that, I've still got to consume the energy. I've still got to have the, you know, I maintain the sort of the water, the filtrations, all of that kind of thing, but I've got no money coming in. So would I be best just pulling the plug out? Is that, you know, is that the best option? I guess for power it might be, but for water it's not. And he was saying absolutely not. Whilst, you know, you've got to keep everything going. The water, I didn't know this, but the water pressure keeps the tiles on the walls. If you change the ventilation or the heat, you know, you have ventilation and condensation issues. And so actually it's massively complex. So these are not simple decisions for business to say, okay, we can cut costs by just doing this. There's lots of knock-on effects as well. But, you know, as leisure centres go back the end of April, May, and people are in there, you know, will they be able to recover? You know, they've had 5-6 months of virtually no income whatsoever. And, you know, were they profitable enough to be able to start paying back all the costs that they've incurred in the last 6 months? And I think the more you start to look at it on a sector by sector basis, the more challenging it will be. And at the moment, it's the energy companies that are taking all the burden for this. Yeah. They have all the debt.
With my sort of university's hat on, it's been really interesting there. So, you know, on one hand, you think, well, the universities are half empty, the students haven't been there, therefore, you know, costs must have gone down. But the reality is the buildings are being repurposed to enable staff to sort of work in different locations. They're having to still maintain the buildings. They're having to open and make sure they've got ventilation. So actually opening the windows during winter is not the best energy efficient sort of way of doing things, but they're having to sort of keep the health and safety aspects up, exactly as Hayley's saying, as well as, you know, keep the wheels going. So actually, for many universities, counterintuitively, consumption's gone up. So actually the bills are going up, which, you know, when you think about it, just doesn't feel logical. But actually, when you work it through, you go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's exactly that sector by sector impact we'll see in different ways. But as a supplier, you don't know all that. You're just looking at the debt.
As you said, I think the general assumption is that obviously domestic has gone through the roof and B2B has, you know, reduced in terms of people working from home and lifestyle changes that have come along with the pandemic. Is that actually the case, or is there something to learn for utilities going forward in terms of that B2B domestic balance?
It's interesting that the statistics, domestic consumption, you would think we've all used a heck of a lot more. It's actually gone up by about 2%. But you've still got to pay for that extra 2%. But business-wise, we had a big dip initially, so it sort of went down by about 15%. But actually, largely, it's come back up again. So it's lower than it was, but it's not. We're at lower levels than normal, but not materially. So because we're using energy in different ways, exactly the points we've just talked about, it's more about not necessarily using it for what you intended to do.
And Jo, as well, earlier you mentioned the price cap, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And will this really make a difference?
Yes, absolutely. So interestingly, Ofgem have just published the latest price cap, which has gone up substantially for this next half year. And most of that is wholesale cost. So we saw as a result of all that reduction in demand, we saw wholesale costs come right down during the early pandemic, and they've now come back up again. But the important piece here in relation to this conversation is around debt. They've put in an allowance of £23, just over £23, for the suppliers to cover debt. And it's a really tricky position for the regulator as well as for the market, because effectively you're saying to consumers, you're going to pay £23 to accommodate everybody else's debt. But on the other hand, if Ofgem don't allow that, then the suppliers will bluntly go bust. So it's a balance of actually, to keep the market going, it is in the consumer's interest that there are suppliers in the market.
And Hayley, your thoughts?
It still always surprises me that, in terms of like you say, the £23, everybody has to pay it to keep it all going. But it is at the moment, the energy suppliers seem that they're really squashed in the middle, in terms of they have no choice. No longer is it possible, practical or acceptable to isolate or disconnect domestic supply. It hasn't been done for years, and it's very, very much frowned upon. So the supplier has no other way. They have to allow people to consume, and and I think for a base commodity, that's the right thing. And on the business side, I think that I'm wondering if there's a lot of there's clearly a lot of debt in the market. I wonder if there's a lot of what I would call fictitious debt in the market as well. A lot of properties they haven't been able to get into, a lot of things that are billing on estimated billing, so that they're building up a picture that's a very much indebted, but actually is it in reality? That's always been a common issue in the utility sector. But they very much are squashed in the middle, aren't they? They're taking all the responsibility right now.
And ultimately, the way the sort of market is designed is that it's called the supplier hub model, whereas effectively the supplier sits in the middle and they pay out to all the different parties who are involved in energy, but they also, interface with the customer. And you have to remember, less than half the bill is actually the cost of energy. The other half is everything else. So the cost of the networks and the cost of energy efficiency support. So there's an awful lot that the suppliers still have to pay those bills, regardless of whether their customers pay or not. So the cost is still going out of those suppliers' balance sheets, but if the debt is not being paid, they are the squeezed middle, as Hayley says.
Yeah, and that's where I was when looking at this earlier. In fact, Kerris and I were talking about this in terms of looking at transmission and distribution network and how their relationship was in the market. How do you think RIIO-2 is going to impact on that? Because looking at some of the transmission companies, they're making some fairly tidy profits.
They have been, and it's RIIO-2 is really interesting. I think there's two things going on. So the biggest picture is we are, committed to net zero by 2050. And to do that, we need a completely different generation mix and the growth of renewables as has been happening, but materially more than what's already there. To do that, you need networks that can support all the new generation and thousands of assets, as opposed to the historic, 20 coal-fired power stations with a couple of nukes sort of on there. So it's a the network companies themselves have a big challenge in terms of transitioning themselves to this new world, which costs a lot of money and needs billions and billions invested into it. So they're also slightly squeezed middle. They're regulated, and obviously the consumer pays for their costs ultimately, but equally they are owned by shareholders, and the shareholder expects a return as well. So in that RIIO2 positioning, it's how do you make sure that you've got the motivation and the incentive to grow your network, but at the same time, how do you make sure that you're making it an attractive sector to invest in, so actually you can attract the investors in the first place, so that the money keeps flowing. And I think money keeping and flowing is absolutely key for this sort of net zero piece. So there's a sense of, there's a long-term view, which is net zero and what we need to do as a sort of a country to transition to that. And then there's a short-term piece, which is consumer debt now, and how you balance the two. Ultimately, there's only so many pounds to go round.
Yeah, I guess for a supplier, it's a question of priorities at the moment, isn't it? You know, I've got the current situation of dealing with my customers, my debt book. I've got a smart meter rollout, which I'm still, you know, targeted on and engaged in, and also I've got all the plans and obligations I might have with regards to net zero. I suppose that, you know, as a supplier perspective and working with some suppliers, I think the here and now is so very much, you know, the priority, because it's the difference between success and failure.
Yeah.
And we've seen so many businesses, in fact, I think it was now 24 businesses, energy companies that have failed in the last 3.5-4 years.
But there's a reality now where there isn't enough margin, there isn't enough value in pure supply. So the suppliers are almost having to reinvent themselves to add valuable services to their customers in order to grow and make money. So when you actually sort of dig into it, whilst the consumer bill is huge and horrible, it's not actually the suppliers who are benefiting. If you really look at the detail, if you're a geek like me, and you look at the Ofgem sort of data, they're now actually reporting negative margins, and that's not sustainable as a supplier. So, you know, they are in a really difficult situation with growing debt, continuing having to pay their costs, but also, you know, not enough inherent margin in supply. So reinventing themselves at the same time.
And that's sometimes one of the roles that we play when we're working with organisations, because it's about that operational efficiency. If they can be really efficient internally, they can really shave off costs. They can really improve their margin. I was on a call yesterday evening with a long-standing sort of ex-colleague. She also worked in the utility industry, and she was telling me about, she'd recently moved house, and the incumbent supplier was a big energy company. I will not name them to save their blushes, but she moved in and she'd been there a few weeks, and she rang up and did the home move and everything, and nobody mentioned ED, nobody mentioned paying the bill. Literally, just 4 days later, she got an invoice in the post and asked to pay by cash or check. And you think there's so many missed opportunities like that. There are people who can't afford to pay bills, and there are people who genuinely try and avoid paying bills. But the majority of the population is actually, you know, very happy to pay on DD. They don't really want to spend time faffing with their utility bills. And so, you know, direct debit is an incredible way to get you sort of maintain the cash flow. Nobody has to do anything then unless they default. So, you know, if you've got hundreds and thousands of customers, it just seemed like such a simple thing that had been missed out. I felt like I wanted to get on the phone and ring them and say, did you know?
It's interesting that I've done a really interesting piece of work recently with a client, which is all around the softer side of debt. And, you know, inevitably people, if you're in a difficult situation, particularly for the first time, if you've never been in debt and all of a sudden you can't afford to pay your bill, it's quite easy just to put it on the side and sort of forget about it for a while and, you know, push it down the track until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and horrendous. And actually what this client was very much focused on, how do we do the softer side? How do we do the human behavioural piece, which is actually exactly as Hayley says, you know, getting on the phone and saying, do you know what, you can do something different. you can help yourself by, you can, you know, and almost doing that softer piece so you avoid getting into that horrible situation in the first place. And that's a completely different way of thinking to sort of the historic, where certainly in my day, you know, many years ago, it would have been, well, you're now onto a Dunning letter 1 or a Dunning letter 2, or a, you know, it just is scary because you're getting redder and redder things coming through the post.
We have a tickle term called effortless cash. And when I'm talking to a company about their debt book, we always look to determine what percentage of it is effortless cash and how you drive up that effortless cash percentage. And direct debit is one of the elements of effortless cash. And if you can get that up to sort of 60, 70, 80%, then, you know, your portfolio becomes self-managing. And it's a lot easier to manage. And you've almost got guaranteed income. It's never 100% guaranteed, but it's very much guaranteed. And I think actually starting to look at your customer portfolio in a different way and with a different approach, and maybe sort of introduce some of the more modern behavioral economics style conversations, would be a lot more effective. And so whilst I express sympathy for them being in the squash middle, I do still think that a lot of the energy companies have got lots of opportunity to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of their systems, but also how the people and their human capital interface with those systems, and are they getting the best out of it?
And I'm such a believer in this human aspect of it. I think often in business, we just talk about sort of process, and we talk about business as a inanimate object. It's not, it's a bunch of people. And people are emotional beings, and you know, they respond to emotional engagement. And actually, I mean, that brings it right back to the one piece. I think, you know, that's where women are particularly good, is understanding that and doing something about it. So it's again bringing that sort of diverse thinking. It's not just about process. Debt is not just about, you know, cash and numbers. It's about humans and helping them to get, and that can be business or consumers themselves, you know, direct consumers. But so much of it is about, you know, helping people understand and how to take action.